slides.
I'll flash them now so you can see.
Sure.
Oh, oh, okay. So this is good. Check. Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Eisgruber, the 20th president of Princeton University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the latest event in the 2018 to 19 Mellon Sawyer Seminar, Global Migration, the Humanities and Social Sciences in Dialogue. This year-long slate of programming lends an interdisciplinary, humanistic approach to a critical and timely subject, the study of migration. Tonight's lecture is titled Globalization in the Times of Political and Academic Populism. It's my great pleasure to be able to introduce the speaker who will deliver that lecture, Professor Ernesto Zedillo, the director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization and the former president of Mexico. Professor Zedillo earned his bachelor's degree at the School of Economics at the National Polytechnic Institute in Mexico, and his MA and PhD at Yale University. He began his career at the Central Bank of Mexico, and he went on to serve Mexico's national government as Secretary of Economic Programming and the Budget, and as Secretary of Education. This dedication to public service culminated in his election as President of Mexico in 1994. Over the next 6 years, Professor Zedillo led Mexico through the worst economic crisis in the country's history. His policies made significant strides toward reducing economic inequality and stabilizing the Mexican economy. Since his term as president, Professor Zedillo has been a leading voice on globalization, migration, and human rights. He is chairman of the board of the Natural Resource Governance Institute, a member of the Global Commission on Drug Policy, and a member of the Elders, a group of global leaders who convene to advance peace, justice, and human rights worldwide. Professor Zedillo has been an influential thought leader as well. His edited volume, Rethinking the War on Drugs Through the U.S.-Mexico Prism, was published in 2012, and 2 other edited volumes on global warming and globalization were published in 2008. His exemplary record of public service has been recognized through numerous awards. To name just a few, he has received the 2002 Franklin D. Roosevelt Freedom from Fear Award, the 2006 Sustainable Development Leadership Award presented by the Energy Resources Institute in New Delhi, and the 2011 International Award of Lifetime Achievement by the Cristobal Gabarrón Foundation of Spain. We are accordingly very fortunate that Professor Zedillo has joined us here today. His life's work exemplifies a commitment to changing the world for the better. Please join me in welcoming Professor Ernesto Zedillo.
Dear members of the Princeton University community, I am very pleased to be back to Princeton. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to President Eisgruber and to Professor Berggruen for their kind invitation to speak here today. I am honored to be introduced by President Eisgruber and to make my remarks in front of him, although, to be honest, it makes me a bit nervous. I was informed that this Sawyer seminar has as its central topic the very pertinent one of global migration, on which I'm not really an expert. I was fortunately given latitude by the organizers to approach this topic from the viewpoint of other issues with which I have been recently engaged. Consequently, I first want to dwell on some general observations and concerns about globalization, and afterwards to comment briefly on one of its particular facets, that of international migration. I start by acknowledging that long gone are the days when widespread enthusiasm about the opportunities offered by globalization was the rule and not the exception. Nowadays, it's quite in vogue, on the one hand, to blame globalization for any number of things that have gone wrong in the world, and on the other, to dismiss the benefits that it has helped to bring about, not least what your own professor, Angus Deaton, has called the Great Escape, the exit of a good chunk of humanity from poverty. What we have now is a globalization backlash, or even globalophobia, particularly since the great crisis of 2008-2009 and its aftermath. The financial panic during the fall of 2008 not only marked the end of the so-called Great Moderation, but also perhaps the beginning of a period of twilight for modern globalization. The world has not been and will not be the same after Lehman Brothers' collapse on September 15, 2008. It is evident that the prospects for most economies, even in the presence of relatively benign world output growth figures of 2017 and 2018, are very different from the ones entertained only a bit more than a decade or so ago. Although the list of factors suspected of contributing to diminish global growth expectations is not an insignificant one, not least as it includes both the mystery of reduced growth productivity as well as the aging of the labor force in advanced countries, particular consideration must be given to the question of whether globalization, a significant growth engine over several decades, might have peaked already and could even be at risk of reverting. The confirmation of this presumption should be hugely concerning for those, like myself, who believe that the payoff of trade expansion has been, on balance, quite favorable, not only for global growth of both developed and emerging economies, but also for increasing average per capita income, reducing poverty rates, and accelerating human development in many developing countries. We get some relief about this concern from those who submit the view that for the most part, the trade slowdown has been driven essentially by cyclical factors, such as the weakness in aggregate demand caused by the Great Crisis over several years, as well as the completion of the phase of fast integration of China and the Central and Eastern European economies into the global economy, a transition that, by definition, could not go on forever. But there are other non-cyclical circumstances that should be of true concern. One is, of course, that the multilateral efforts to further liberalize trade have failed terribly for many years, not least the Doha Round, now totally defunct, despite the multiple pledges to complete it made by the G20 in the aftermath of the crisis. Another is the increase in protectionism that rather quietly, in a murky way, avoiding large-scale increases in the average level of border protection, took place over several years, again, despite the solemn pledges of the G20. The failure of further multilateral liberalization and the occurrence of creeping protectionism were bad enough for the prospects of global growth. But a much worse scenario has now emerged as a consequence of the trade wars that are actively being pursued by the government of none other than the major economic power in the world, the United States. This is a scenario that, unthinkable until recently, has now been materializing. The current US government has provided ample evidence, rather aggressively, of its protectionist stance. There was, of course, the very early decision by the Trump administration to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, an action never really satisfactorily justified by the US president or any member of his cabinet. There was also the action to initiate the renegotiation of the North American Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, on false or at best wrong-headed premises that NAFTA caused, and I quote, literally quote, the explosion of US trade deficits, the closure of thousands of factories, and the abandonment of millions of American workers. These deceptive premises might help to explain why so little progress had been made after almost 1 year of talks. After 7 rounds of negotiations, and even a long suspension of the formal talks, betting in mid-July of this year for a conclusion of the renegotiation of NAFTA within the targeted time frame would have looked like an overwhelmingly losing proposition. The deadlock was quite understandable. The US trade representatives had not moved a single inch from their most outlandish demands, giving credence to the idea that what they were really seeking was to impose an agreement on their counterparts that, far from promoting, would have destroyed trade and investment among the NAFTA partners. Fortunately, the Canadian and Mexican governments did not cave to the US government's pretension. Repeatedly, those countries' chief negotiators expressed firmly and credibly that they would rather take the unilateral termination of NAFTA by the United States than sign an agreement that would have had the same practical consequence. As August approached, the US government started to move away from most of the recalcitrant positions it had held for almost a year, leading ultimately to a deal first with Mexico on August 27, and then with Canada in the last hours of September 30, 2018. The only significant demand by the US accommodated by Mexico and Canada was in the automotive sector, where more restrictive and cumbersome rules of origin would be adopted. Fortunately, the destructive effects of the new rules of origin for trade and investment could be mitigated in the case of cars by the provision that vehicles failing to fulfill those rules would simply pay the low most favored nation tariff of 2.5%, as long as total exports do not exceed an agreed reasonable number of vehicles. As purported from day one, the trade agreement will be subject to an update on a number of topics such as digital trade, intellectual property rights, environmental policies, and labor practices. Interestingly, the agreed new provisions really are a cut and paste of what was contained in the TPP discarded early on by the Trump administration. NAFTA negotiations aside, trade hostilities by the United States generally escalated significantly in 2018, targeting first and foremost China, but other partners as well, such as the European Union, Japan, Turkey, Canada, and Mexico, with tariffs to which, predictably, all the affected countries responded at once by announcing their own retaliatory trade actions. The US has put the world on trade war alert. By September 2018, the total value of Chinese imports subject to US tariffs had risen to $250 billion, with tariffs on a further $236 billion threatened. This threat has now been suspended temporarily as a result of the truce agreed to by the US and Chinese presidents last weekend in Buenos Aires. The trade aggressiveness, rather than an intelligent use of diplomacy against China, is not easy to understand, not only because hardly any robust evidence has been provided about the imputed unfairness of China's own trade practices, which, if true, would warrant a strong case to be judged by the WTO appellate body, but also because it seems to ignore other aspects of the already significant interdependence between the American and Chinese economies. Among other things, the US government overlooks the effect of China's imports from the US in supporting the latter's economic growth, as well as the favorable impact of the lower price of Chinese exports on the real wage of American workers. It also seems to ignore how large the revenues of American companies, $300 billion plus annually, in China have become, not to speak of those companies' real and intangible assets long ago grounded in Chinese territory. Both circumstances are flanks of vulnerability that should not be ignored by the US government. By the same token, the fact that China has substantial holdings of US dollar-denominated assets shouldn't be disregarded. The excess savings available in China that feeds its current account surplus provide the resources that the US has been happy to borrow over many years to compensate for its own very low savings rate. It is hard to know whether the American administration really believes that sooner rather than later, China and the other targeted countries will succumb to the United States' peculiar demands and thus deliver a win in the trade confrontation. If this were the assumption, most likely a wrong one, the trade war could reach epic proportions with irreversible damage. Even worse, however, the US authorities could be envisioning a scenario in which the affected parties implement full recourse to the WTO, and this is taken as an excuse to withdraw from that institution, as President Trump has sometimes threatened to do. This episode of American neo-mercantilism can hardly have a happy ending, simply because it has been launched on very wrong premises and with questionable objectives. The US government's ongoing policy not only ignores the notion of comparative advantage and its modern incarnation into complex supply chains, but also the essential insight from open economy macroeconomics that the difference between an economy's national income and its expenditure is what drives its current account and trade balances. Playing with trade policy without looking at the underlying variables of income and expenditure is bound to be futile and counterproductive. Furthermore, focusing on bilateral balances to fix the aggregate one makes the undertaking even more pointless. How far and how deep the newly adopted American protectionist stance is taken will determine more than any other circumstance whether modern globalization is in its twilight or simply recedes temporarily. Of course, other factors that must be duly acknowledged will be at play to determine the ultimate outcome, but the decisive weight of US policies needs to be factored properly into any exercise of prognosis about globalization. If the capricious withdrawal from the TPP, the arbitrary imposition of import tariffs against products of its main trading partners, and the unjustified rhetoric that accompanied the renegotiation of NAFTA were the guide to predict the gravity of US policies, it would be prudent to envision a dramatic compression of globalization in the years to come. This would happen in a scenario where a tit-for-tat vicious cycle of rising trade barriers happens, along with the annihilation, formal or de facto, of the WTO and the other cooperative instruments that exist to govern international trade and investment. Obviously, this would be an outcome, economic and otherwise, of practically catastrophic proportions for the US, its main trading partners, and all the other participants in the global economy. A considerably less disruptive scenario could be imagined if the process to devolve NAFTA into a United States-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, I don't know how you say it, were the relevant guide. As argued before, the New Deal, if ratified, while not really a meaningful improvement over NAFTA, would still be capable of allowing a reasonable degree of rules-based, mutually convenient trade, not optimal, but substantial among the trade partners. Fortunately for all involved, the protectionist rhetoric displayed by the American authorities was not matched in the end by their actions to conclude the deal. In fact, the termination of NAFTA would have been the only outcome matching the aggressive and bombastic positions they held from the beginning to right before the end of the talks. The equally bombastic exaggerations utilized to announce the purported virtues of the new agreement could also be suggestive. The script that seemed to be used by the US government in the NAFTA negotiations was: demand unreasonably, negotiate aggressively, make any possible deal, declare victory, and move on. If this were truly the blueprint that the US government intends to follow to restructure the country's trade relations with the rest of the world, then the damage, if not negligible, will be contained. But even in the least pessimistic scenario, other important issues will have to be addressed in the years to come if a twilight of contemporary globalization is going to be avoided and it is allowed instead to continue being, on balance, a powerful force for prosperity and international peace and security. For one thing, all the other major economic powers of the world should deal intelligently with the ongoing American predicament, with a view to certainly contain the aggressiveness of the US actions while doing their best to protect the rules-based international system and the provision of global public goods. Crucially, for globalization to deliver to its full potential, all governments should take more seriously the essential insight provided by economics that open markets need to be accompanied by policies that make their impact less disruptive and more beneficially inclusive for the population at large. Advocates of globalization should also be more effective in contending with the conundrum posed by the fact that it has become pervasive, even for serious academics, to postulate almost mechanically a causal relationship between open markets and many social and economic ills. Linking abominable inequities to trade and even to technological progress, as has become fashionable, misses the point entirely on two important accounts. First, because it denies that those inequities are much more the consequence of explicit domestic policies unrelated to trade issues. By focusing on the latter, the important fact that the inequities are fundamentally the result of past political choices is overlooked. Second, by committing this omission, it becomes more likely to incur in serious policy mistakes, with the practical consequence that the inequities purported as undesirable will tend to be further perpetuated. Trade policy will never be a first best one to deal with the problems that rightly have increasingly captured the attention of citizens and political leaders in most countries, both developed and emerging. Problems such as poverty, increasing inequality, and marginalization. These ills, less the result of historical initial conditions than of deliberate policy decisions by political leaderships unduly influenced over time by the holders of economic power, if they are to be addressed seriously, it must be done with institutions and policies conformed explicitly for such purposes. This is a clear-cut political choice that obviously poses a trade-off with other objectives, such as low taxation, that a lot of people love, that may be considered important by some economic and political constituencies. The real dilemmas must be acknowledged and acted upon, and not evaded as is done when tweaking trade policy is wrongly alleged to be the instrument with which to address unacceptable social ills. The tendency to impute a range of ills to globalization is, of course, not a new one. Open markets, for a host of reasons, are always contentious. But making globalization the preferred culprit to explain all kinds of unsavory situations with the intensity reached lately could be consequential for the continuity of the process, causing great damage to its potential to provide vast development opportunities. More subtly, but equally negative, is, let me insist, that such a tendency entails deflecting responsibility away from domestic policies and towards external forces as the source of problems actually caused by those policies themselves. Blaming the various dimensions of globalization, trade, financial, and migration for phenomena such as insufficient GDP growth, stagnant wages, inequality, and unemployment always seems to be preferable for governments rather than admitting their failure to deliver on their own responsibility. As observed repeatedly, the most extreme case of such a deflection of responsibility is found in populist politicians. More than any other kind, the populist politicians have a marked tendency to blame others for their country's problems and failings. That is why restrictions, including draconian ones on trade, investment, and migration, are an essential part of the populist policy arsenal. Populists praise isolationism and avoid international engagement, except with their foreign populist cronies. The full package of populism frequently includes anti-market economics, xenophobic and autarkic nationalism, contempt for multilateral rules and institutions, and authoritarian politics. The case of sheer populist mercantilism is in contrast with the one of other doubters who purport to challenge globalization or at least some aspects of it, from a platform of serious scholarship. Highly respectable researchers have over time produced work that is used by themselves or misused by others to weaken the intellectual and practical case of economic interdependence. Given serious consideration to the arguments advanced by those challengers, is justified not only because they raise a number of valid points, but also because of the influence that what I consider their less reasonable observations could have presently and in the future on practical policy. It is well beyond the scope of this talk to make a comprehensive survey of the globalization skeptic research produced by highly respectable scholars. I will limit my succinct comments here to the work published by an admirable academic who truly pioneered the encouragement of thinking differently about globalization, and who is a good friend and personally I admire very much. But anyways, for more than 2 decades, Harvard professor Danny Roderick has insisted on providing arguments that have proven effective to make observers less cheerful about globalization. His work is distinct, among other reasons, because paradoxically, he claims to do that work from the framework of orthodox neoclassical economics. Needless to say, hardly anybody would dare to question how prescient were a number of concerns expressed by Roderick in his 1997 book, Has Globalization Gone Too Far? Particularly when one takes into account that the volume came to light some years before globalization peaked under the impulse of China's unprecedented surge in world markets in the early years of the 21st century. The book was also in circulation, also ahead of the anti-WTO riots of November 1999 in Seattle, and certainly many years before the financial crisis and its sequel that actually has comprised a marked slowdown in globalization, still continuing after more than a decade. Professor Roderick should be given credit today for submitting more than 20 years ago the possibility of, and I quote, a political backlash against trade, stemming from a deep fault line between groups who have the skills and mobility to flourish in global markets and those who either don't have these advantages or perceive the expansion of unregulated markets as inimical to social stability and deeply held norms. Since I always disagree with commentators who thought of modern globalization as irreversible by virtue of being driven, in their view, essentially by technological progress, which cannot be undone, I found myself in excellent rapport with Roderick when he expressed that continued globalization should not be taken for granted and that a retreat from openness is always possible. Throughout his 1997 volume, Roderick insisted on the concept of social disintegration, which encapsulated various worrisome phenomena such as the stagnation of wages among various categories of employees in developed countries and the worsening income distribution, trends that at the time were incipient and that were firmly confirmed over the next 20 years. On perceiving the emergence of such social disintegration, well before it became so pervasive in many countries, Roderick was undoubtedly right. In my view, however, he was wrong in jumping too soon to the conclusion that globalization was the cause of it. Roderick's argumentation did not start with a hypothesis to be tested, but rather with the premise that the social tensions that he was depicting were being generated by globalization and globalization alone. No serious consideration was given to other forces and circumstances that could have been at the root of the ills that he presciently identified. The simultaneous occurrence or correlation of globalization and social bads became tantamount to causality from the first to the second. With that premise as the bedrock of the inquiry, it became just a matter of imagination to narrate the numerous unequivocal relations between globalization and socially unjust outcomes. As globalization deepened, and some of the social trends highlighted early on by Roderick were also reaffirmed. The author's original critique of globalization not only has been reiterated, but actually augmented, as have his prescriptions to deal with the issues at hand. A significant enhancement of the critique was provided in his 2011 book, The Globalization Paradox. As with his previous contributions, that volume is full of ideas and observations with which it's impossible not to agree. Nevertheless, I differ profoundly with the book's central proposition that there is a fundamental trilemma among democracy, national sovereignty, and globalization. If true, the trilemma, it would imply that the options for countries are to restrict democracy in the interest of pursuing globalization, to limit globalization in the pursuit of building domestic democratic legitimacy, or to globalize democracy at the cost of national sovereignty. That the Roderick trilemma has acquired credence among some scholars and students of the social sciences is intriguing for somebody like me with credentials, albeit modest, as a dedicated promoter of democracy, free trade, and a rules-based international system sustained by sovereign nations. International covenants and institutions, however imperfect they may be, are the best vehicle that weak and emerging countries have to guard themselves from the arbitrary exercise of economic and geopolitical force by the most powerful countries. Thus, global governance, far from being a threat to country sovereignty, can be its protector. I also question whether globalization conspires against democratic legitimacy. The latter, hard to achieve and even harder to sustain, ultimately depends on delivering widely the goods of prosperity, which historically is more likely to happen in open rather than in closed economies. Consequently, it is not true that for countries to pursue democracy, it is necessary for them to somehow disengage from globalization. This would be valid only under the Roderick basic premise that globalization by itself explains a significant number of maladies present in the world. A country in the south or in the north can be democratic, economically open, and engage in the multilateral rules-based system while simultaneously exercising its sovereignty, the latter being understood, of course, in the modern sense of the word. Frankly, I have not been surprised now that isolationist populism has risen in the most unusual places that Professor Roderick has proceeded to launch his third major charge on globalization. He's now submitting that the ongoing populist eruption was perfectly predictable, and although he admits that other factors had been at play, he points to economic globalization as the ultimate culprit of the disgraceful emergence of populism, not only in the incredibly dangerous US case happening before our eyes, but also in previous episodes in various parts of the world, including my own region, Latin America. Reading about Roderick's association between populism and economic interdependence, those of us from Latin America who have studied populism, but also oppose and also suffer populism, and think of our long list of homegrown populist strongmen, are tempted to ask, just as Professor Jadis Bhagwati, paraphrasing a Tina Turner pop song, famously did, what's globalization got to do with it? Do you know the song? Indeed, Roderick's inquiry into the economic roots of populism is not devoid of useful facts and considerations that proved helpful to understand and contend with the ongoing upsurge in xenophobic and autarkic populism in the United States and elsewhere. My concern is that by focusing on globalization and de-emphasizing what he calls the other factors at play, Roderick may be aiming at a straw man and missing more important targets, which is a recipe to render policy prescriptions to be of uncertain and even nil, not to say counterproductive value. A glance at some of his proposals should suffice to justify this concern. Although his 1997 contribution claimed not to be prescriptive, it actually went so far as to call for multilateral rules on how countries can depart from multilateral rules. It advocated, barely 3 years after the formal start of the WTO, to find new ways for countries to disengage selectively from multilateral disciplines. In particular, Roderick submitted that the WTO escape clause, the safeguard mechanism, should be changed to give countries even more latitude to deviate from their trade liberalization commitments in order to pursue other domestic policy objectives. An expanded version of Roderick's early request for a more flexible trading system was a key proposal in the Globalization Paradox of 2011, where he suggested a radical shift from market access to policy space as the core matter of multilateral negotiations. With this change, countries will be allowed to suspend their WTO commitments, arguably to pursue their development priorities. In an early review of the book, I claim, and still do, that if adopted, Roderick's formula would be a safe bet, not only for perpetual conflict, but also for regression into autarky. To sweeten his spiel of trade and investment deglobalization, Professor Roderick calls for leaders to focus on reforming the rules that govern international labor mobility, and goes so far as to propose a temporary work visa that would expand rich countries' labor force by no more than 3%. Of course, this idea makes economic sense. I count myself among those who have advocated bilateral and multilateral agreements among countries to manage international migration, to maximize its benefits and minimize its downsides. I have been part of several proposals with that goal, most recently in 2016 through an initiative by the Center for Global Development to formulate a model of bilateral worker agreement between the US and Mexico intended to improve the functioning of our labor markets, curtail unlawful cross-border mobility, while also preserving priority for American workers for jobs in the US and enhancing common security on both sides of our border. Our proposal was made public in the summer of 2016, but needless to say, a few months afterwards, it became chimerical, to say the least. This is a shame because there are significant costs for both countries without an agreement, certainly for the US, which will continue to spend enormous resources on alternatives that will never deliver the expected results. Of course, I would not discourage any of you from looking at our proposal, despite being unachievable for now. But going back to Roderick, Why does he think that governing international labor mobility would have any political opportunity to be adopted anytime soon? And why does he think it would compensate for the losses that would be caused by undermining or even destruction of the multilateral trading system, outcome that he seems to be advocating? Some of you may be tempted at this point to interpellate me to express that as soon as next Tuesday, the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration will be adopted at a meeting convened by the United Nations Organization in Morocco. That compact stems from the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants adopted at the United Nations in 2016. The negotiation of the compact had as key references previous work that, mindful of the complexity and contentiousness of the topic, was all along infused with substantial and balanced realism. One of those essential references was the report prepared by the late Peter Sutherland, an admired advocate of multilateral international cooperation, reflecting on his decade of work as the UN's Special Representative for International Migration. The Sutherland report clearly admits that nations have no obligation to open their borders to all migrants. While the benefits of migration are tangible, he wrote, they do take time to materialize, but their associated costs can appear immediately for individuals and even entire social groups. This is a situation that must be acknowledged and addressed with practical solutions. The report also makes clear that although orderly migration depends on providing expanded pathways for legal entry, these must be subject to labor market considerations. Sutherland wasn't shy to recommend circular back and forth migration as an effective way to manage the movement of people between poorer countries and richer ones. Another report published in early 2017 by the United Nations Secretary General, Antonio Guterres himself, with the support of his special representative, Louis Arbour, acknowledges at the outset that migration can be a source of division within and between states and societies, even though it is also an engine of economic growth, innovation, and sustainable development. He argued that states and their citizens have legitimate reasons to demand both secure borders and the capacity to determine who enters and stays in their country. The report also warned that since states can hold divergent perspectives on the benefits and costs of migration, governments must be mindful of each other's specific priorities and challenges. Guterres, therefore, advised against ignoring citizens' perceptions and concerns of migration policy. All United Nations member states, the US included, had committed in September of 2016 to negotiate the compact with plans to approve it by the end of this year. This objective did not look overly ambitious. On the one hand, the compact will not be legally binding, which should have made governments more accommodating. On the other hand, it was intended simply to agree on a set of general principles and commitments for countries to deal with international migration. Yet, when significant progress had been made to agree on the Global Compact, the US ambassador to the United Nations announced almost a year ago, December of 2017, that her country was abandoning the process. The reason given was simply that decisions on immigration policies must always be made by Americans and Americans alone. That argument rejected a simple fact. No country can address the challenges and opportunities of international migration on its own. The US withdrawal, if not fatal for the compact, has diminished significantly its relevance. The negotiations and agreement on the Global Compact were concluded this July, past July, and will be adopted, as I mentioned, next week. It achieves the balance and realism envisioned by Ban Ki-moon and Antonio Guterres by delivering an agenda to strengthen the rule of law, bring the challenges that migration creates under control, and respond effectively and beneficially to the realities of demography and labor markets. But as much as I agree with the objectives and commitments contained in the Compact, which I invite you to discuss, an interesting document, and as much as I hope that one day, not too far in the future, to the benefit of their own citizens, all states will act together and cooperatively to make migration safe, orderly, and legal, as purported in the Global Compact, I am afraid that for the time being, it will also prove to be a chimerical undertaking. For this and other reasons, I strongly reject Roderick's proposal of giving up the existing rules-based international trading system in exchange for a chimerical promise of a global agreement on international labor mobility. It is my conviction that particularly under the present circumstances, the existing multilateral system and the degree of economic integration that painstakingly have been achieved since the end of the Second World War, with, until recently, the unquestionable leadership of the United States, must be defended. That's the priority number one. And an essential part of that defense is to inquire and address inequities and injustices that all of us deplore and that demagogues around the world are using to grab and abuse political power. Thank you. And as commanded by the President, I will be very happy to answer questions. Please.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. I have studied globalization for more than 30 years, and I can use your help in understanding one thing, which has something to do with the latter part of your presentation. By that I'm referring to a relationship between the application of neoliberal economic policies and immigration. My question is about NAFTA, about the original document, very long, which I have read in very great detail. And my question, and I'm asking for both your factual interpretation and your opinion, is why is it that the parties crafting NAFTA never considered labor mobility? By that I'm saying borders were open to facilitate investments and the mobility of capital across international borders. It would have made sense to some rather moderate thinkers to really consider equally prudent measures to regulate and organize labor mobility, and that was never included.
Well, NAFTA is a free trade agreement.
Yes.
It was never intended to be a negotiation for a common market. And therefore, it was never entertained as a possible objective of the negotiation. Of course, Mexico would have loved to have that issue in the list of topics to be negotiated, but there was no opening whatsoever for that part. It was simply an agreement to negotiate a free trade agreement, and there was no possibility that the question of labor mobility could be put at the table. And I should say, because the US would not have accepted, and probably not even Canada. that was considered a different matter. And I think was for political reasons that I think current events make even more evident.
Zedillo, may I ask if people could come now and use the microphones to ask their questions? That will allow us to get the question on tape and make sure that everybody can hear.
Please.
Just come down to the microphones. Right. Just one on each side.
Buenas tardes. Comparative advantage is a one-dimensional thing, it seems to me. There are other dimensions that should be considered. So I want to ask you your view on that. I mean, some of the things would be the destruction of communities from layoff, the additional costs for welfare and unemployment payments, comparative labor standards overseas from the trading partners and so forth. So how would you propose to correct for that? So just a one-dimensional comparative advantage seems to have a lot of destructive possibilities to it. Without large tariffs, what do you think?
Well, what I am arguing, and I do it strongly, is that, of course, that all of those ills should be addressed, definitely. Number two, I am arguing that there is a deflection of responsibility by political leaders when they acknowledge those ills as something that they don't like, their societies don't like, you don't like, I don't like, but they say all these ills happen because we have more open markets than we used to have. An end of the story. That's basically the story. They deflect responsibility from away from political decisions that they or their predecessors have explicitly taken in the past because they decided how to distribute government expenditure. They decided whether or not to undertake, and with certain characteristics, the tax reform, whether not to have ambitious social policies that address directly questions of poverty and poor income distribution. And when they face all these ills, the easiest expedient is to say, oh, you know, it's about open markets, it's about globalization, without actually providing any significant evidence. And many of them being aware that they are not telling the truth. Basically, they don't want to acknowledge that in exercising their political power, they were more interested in protecting certain particular interests of people who have the real economic power in their societies and who had been traditionally extracting rents or enjoying rents. And that, by the way, they don't like competition because it's nice to have rents without much effort. And they build these narratives plagued with labels like it's about neoliberal economics, it's about believing too much to Ricardo. Well, my argument is simply that's not true. Why don't we discuss policies? Why don't we discuss macroeconomic policies? Why don't we discuss social policies? Many of which have nothing to do with trade or international investment. As I have claimed many times, if you want to have good social policies that address seriously those issues, you have to be very careful. You have to be very targeted, very decisive. People get bothered when I say doing, implementing, and executing a good social policy. It's a highly technical exercise. It is not sufficient to have a good heart and good intentions. and I like to provide a modest, well, not modest now, because it has been copied by more than 40 countries, the conditional cash transfer program that we established in Mexico in the 1990s. And it was a very technocratic exercise in the sense that we say, okay, what do we want? We want to attack poverty in the poorest communities in Mexico. Tell me what is the theory. Tell me what are the empiricals. What have we done in the past that was right, that was wrong? Let us do testing, pilot testing. Let us do a design that allows us to test the program afterwards. It was very technocratic. But you know what? It was very effective. And indeed, we were able, with not so much money, to do it. And for some reason, later on, the World Bank promoted it in many other countries. And my question is, was I limited by trade policy to do that in any way? No, not at all. On the contrary, probably the fact that we could have faster GDP growth because we had become open gave us the possibility of having that level of ambition. So I keep repeating that. It's very dangerous to confuse the adversary, particularly to deflect responsibility away from domestic political and policy decisions.
Thank you for a thoughtful response.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much.
Okay, yeah, sorry. There is this cute light, sort of. Yeah, now I see you and then you're next. Sorry, yeah? Yeah.
Hi. So you argue that an emerging country's best defense is to have open trade. But the thing is that doesn't open trade make emerging countries more susceptible to neo-imperialism? And in that case, what would be your definition of sovereignty?
Well, I didn't say that the best defense is open trade. I said that the best defense for a country's sovereignty is to belong to a rules-based multilateral system, not only on trade, on everything. I think having the United Nations, having the whole array of multilateral institutions is in the best interest of both the weak and the powerful of this world. Are those institutions perfect? No, because to begin with, they are the consequence of negotiations and interplay of interests among the powerful ones and between the powerful and the weak ones. And diplomacy is about that. It's about negotiation and it's about compromise. But certainly, developing countries, emerging countries like mine and all of them, I think we are better off by having a multilateral system rather than having the law of the jungle. I didn't say that open trade. I mean, open trade is an instrument among many and in our view must be regulated by a multilateral institution, not by the unilateral decisions of the most powerful, because then we are in a very weak and vulnerable situation.
Thank you.
Hi. So I want to ask you about the point you made about how states don't have to compromise democracy in order to have free trade and be part of globalization, and how political actors should be responsible for their policies. So I was wondering, in the case of Mexico, as you know, after NAFTA came into effect in 1994, there were very strong oppositions from indigenous groups and uprisings, and that was followed by state campaign of violence and repression, and even the Actial massacre of 1997. And you even have a human rights lawsuit for this massacre against you. So I was wondering, how do you conflate what happened in Mexico and the way that the state responds to opposition with this idea of globalization?
No, thank you very much. Well, first, a very simple observation, which proves again the fallacy of associating things. The NAFTA came into effect. What day? January 1st, 1994. When did the EZLN movement became public? January 1st, 1994. And now I'm hearing a story from you that NAFTA, which was being born that day, caused the rebellion of the EZLN. No, that's what you said. I don't think you meant to say it. But this is an example in which one has to be very careful to see, not because two things are happening simultaneously in the world, you will say that A and B, if this happened together at the same time, B is causing A or A causing B. I mean, it may be the case, but one has to be a little bit more rigorous than that. The roots of this situation, of course, was a profound social injustice that actually got worse and much worse, not when Mexico became a bit more open on trade, but well before. I would say that the mismanagement of the economy in the 1970s and in the 1980s, the government spending on extravagant factories which were highly unproductive and needed great subsidies, instead of spending the money on people and instead of spending the money on indigenous people. I think that was the real cause of the conflict, because they had reason to be angry. They suffered the injustice, right? But to say that NAFTA caused that, well, it's not a problem. No, we have to take another question. Next, here.
Thanks so much for taking our questions. My question is very related to the one that the student just mentioned. I wrote it down. What is your perspective on the human rights abuses of migrant families seeking refuge and asylum in Mexico and the US? Connected to this, is there a way for presidents such as Enrique Peña Nieto and Donald Trump to be held accountable for the damage they have caused to thousands of families? As a student just mentioned, your presidential government in Mexico is accused of having committed grave violations of human rights against indigenous populations in Chiapas. What do you respond to that?
Well, the last is false. I didn't, and the facts are there. And on the other, I think you have to distinguish, with all due respect, between the position that has taken the American government vis-a-vis this group of people that started this march from Central America and towards the border, and the position and the actions of the Mexican government. The Mexican government has offered options to these people, has offered the possibility of staying in Mexico. The intention of most of these people is to be taken as political refugees.
To the allegations of hundreds of thousands of disappeared migrants in Mexico from the Calderón era and the Peña Nieto era, and the thousands of violations that the Comisión Nacional de Derechos Humanos
I
has
cannot
filed.
speak on behalf of President Calderón or President Peña Nieto, and not even on behalf of President Trump, for obvious reasons. But you were referring to this, I thought, to this latest episode. And of course, it's a very serious problem because those people, many of them, want not to stay in Mexico. Others have already stayed in Mexico. I understand that many are already working and living in Mexico. And I am very pleased that the Mexican government has proceeded in that way. But it's up to the US to apply their laws. I will never tell the US government what to do, as long as what they do is within their laws and they respect human rights. I think it's very unfortunate because it has been used politically in a very negative way, but I will invoke a differentiation. But you are right. In the past, we have complained about the way in which Mexicans are treated in the United States. and we haven't done enough to apply the standard we would like to see in our own country. But we also have done things that were important. I remember very well when there were terrible conflicts in Central America, civil wars in Guatemala, in El Salvador, in Nicaragua, and thousands of Central Americans came to Mexico, and they were assimilated into the Mexican society. And in some cases of Guatemalan people, they were offered places to settle in the Yucatan Peninsula. Then when the Civil War was ended, and the situation that had originated the movement of these people into Mexico, the circumstances changed. The Mexican government said, okay, now there is peace, because a peace agreement had been concluded in Guatemala, and we want to give you the option. You want to stay in Mexico and keep in the land that was allocated to you, or you want to go back to your country? And they decided. And I tell you all this because that was a very important moment in my life, when I went to the High Commissioner for Refugees, Mrs. Ogata, to Campeche State, you know. And some said, we want to stay, we want to be part of this country, but others say, no, we are going back to our land in Guatemala. And there I was with Mrs. Ogata, and saw that large group of people walking back to their country with a new hope. And others, you know, staying in Mexico, and we went there, and it was incredible. So yes, some bad facts and news get highlighted, but intends also to be forgotten. And sometimes you have to talk to people. I mean, what was the Latin American country that embraced the refugees from the civil war in Spain? What was the Latin American country that embraced the Argentinians that were being killed by the Argentinian dictatorship? What was the country that embraced our Chilean brothers and sisters who were repressed by Pinochet? I think we had a bit of a bad history, but we also have a history of which we feel extremely proud, that unfortunately tends to be forgotten. Next.
Hi. I actually had a question relating to, well, my father actually worked under your administration as
Sorry?
My father worked for you when you were president as the...
How was he doing? Was he good?
He enjoyed it, yes, he was good, I think.
What work
I
was
wasn't
he
born
doing?
yet. Excuse me?
What work was he doing?
He was the director of economic and special studies for your in-house polling operation.
For what?
For your in-house polling operation under Shapiro. So, anyways. So I had a question.
Say hello to him.
Excuse me?
My regards.
Oh. So I had a question. Since you had the in-house polling operation, how did that, to what
The
extent?
what?
Your in-house polling operation? Polling.
What? No, I don't. In-house polling. In-house polling. Yes, we had, there was this guy, Ulises Beltran.
Para el trabajo.
Yeah, Ulises Beltran worked, yes, in the office of the president. It's not that I saw, no, I shouldn't tell this in public, he can get very angry. I didn't pay much attention to the polls, but anyways.
To what extent did that affect your policy making, actually?
Sorry?
To what extent did that affect, having all the data, did that affect your
No,
policy making?
not much. You know, because and probably I wouldn't have survived in these times of Twitter, right? Without paying attention to the polls. But to be honest, the beginning of that administration was a bit complicated, to say the least. When I became president, That country had negative foreign exchange reserves, had liabilities to be paid within a month of $25 billion. And that was just the beginning of the story. We had the tragic events in the southeast of Mexico. The country was, divided, and it was not easy. So my thinking was, you have to do what you have to do in a democratic way. Those first days, I told the Mexican people, the situation is difficult, and we are going to have to take very difficult decisions. And believe me that if we don't take these decisions, then the cost that we will pay will be even much higher. So sorry, we are going to do it because this is best for everybody. And of course, it's not easy because politically, that's the moment to go against whoever has the responsibility to take decisions. And in the middle of that, I have the occurrence, in the middle of that economic crisis, to start a political reform, right? I ask political parties to come, all of them, and say, none of you has questioned that I won the election. I don't have a problem of legitimacy. Or do I? I asked them, no, you don't. Okay, you won. You got 50.1% of the vote. And the votes were well counted. But I had said already as president-elect in my party, I went to my party and said our election was legal, but was not fair because we had advantages. And you know what? That's unacceptable. And from day one, we are going to work with other political parties to do a political reform so that when this government finishes, we can call Mexican democracy a normal democracy, right? And so I had to deal with the economic crisis, and I had to work with political parties. And all of that I consulted. I was, because it was a tactic, if you wish. I was the first president, perhaps for sure in modern Mexican history, who would go to Congress, not just on September 1st to give the annual address to the nation, a rather peculiar ceremony that used to exist. I was only 2 or 3 days in office, and I went to have lunch with all members of Congress at their own house. And then the next day I went to the Senate and to tell them, what things we needed to do. The first reform I promoted was on day 2nd of office, saying we need to have an independent judiciary because a democracy needs checks and balances. And you know what? In less than 1 month, we had passed the reform, supported by all political parties. And the political reform was very difficult to negotiate because, of course, given the economic situation, it lent itself to a lot of pressure and even blackmail, but said, no, let us be patient. We have to get it. And advisors would say, you don't need it. Why are you doing this? Well, I'm doing it because we need it. All of us need it, right? And we got it. After 18 months, we got the electoral reform, and I think it has made a difference. I think for the better, others will say for the worse. I am absolutely convinced that for the better, I had to take very strong measures on the economy. So if I had been looking at the polls, probably I would have been intimidated. But I can tell you a story. When I had just left office, I went to have lunch at a friend's house, and he had in his operation, he has a magazine, he does some polling, and he said, I want to give you a present, And it was a graph showing the approval of the president, in that case myself, and he showed me that when I left office, I had an approval of around 70%. And I look at the graph, and went back and look at April of 1995. And that month, I think my approval was lower than the annualized rate of inflation. No, but this is serious, because I said, Federico, I said his name, Federico Reyes-Heroles, was the friend who showed me that. And I said, Federico, thanks for highlighting the 70%. But you know when was my proudest moment as president? In April 95, when my approval was less than 20%. And it was my proudest moment, because what I was doing then, in my view, was needed by the country. And I did it. People didn't like it, but I was absolutely convinced that that was the way to go if we were going to overcome the crisis. Unfortunately, I was lucky or whatever, because after overcoming 95, Mexico had, for 5 years, an average rate of GDP growth of 5%, which we hadn't had in a quarter of a century, and which we haven't had ever since. And we were also able to do social policies that to this day, fortunately, continue to be considered good ones.
Professor Zedillo, I think we're time for one more question.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I had a quick question about communication, in that it would seem to me that so I think most people in this room would agree with you about the benefits of globalization, but the rise of many right-wing movements across the world that are pretty against globalization would suggest that a large portion of the population doesn't realize the benefits. And it would seem that there's some sort of failure of communication, in that people like us don't necessarily feel the costs of globalization firsthand, and perhaps more importantly, people who are suffering the impacts of globalization don't realize the costs of the benefits. And so what I was wanting to ask you is, what can be done to remove this failure of communication between these two stratified people?
Well, I think you point to two issues, really. One is the failure of communication, and I think it's evident that people who believe in economic and political freedom have not been efficient in conveying the value of those freedoms. But also you pointed to something which is structural. Say, those who benefit from it are not willing to come forward and say, come on, if it were, or maybe they don't even know that part of their well-being depends on the interdependence that their countries have economically with other countries. And even if they know, say, well, why should I say it? It is what it is, and that's it. And then you have those who, for sure, have been affected and have not been protected effectively by policies. And there should be policies to protect those policies. But then there is another sector which has emerged, and I think in a very poisonous way. That probably is people who have benefited a lot from globalization, but have discovered that they can score political gains simply by blaming others for whatever goes wrong around them. And as the old fascist recipe says, you keep repeating a lie until it becomes a truth. And that is why, those who believe that it is a lie and can see the consequences of abiding by demagogues and populists and extremist positions, well, should also come forward to debate, to argue, and to fight in the good sense of the word for those freedoms. I don't think we are losing the battle. but we are going through a difficult problem because these people, really want to go back to pre-Enlightenment times, and that's very, very dangerous. So thank you very much. No. Yeah, I'm sorry.
So much.
No,
That was
thank you.
wonderful. And thank you, Kristen, for standing up and telling people. to go to
No,
the
it's a
light.
good.
Yes. Great.
I would have asked about Carlos Slim.
Huh?
Carlos Slim.
What?
Your comments on Carlos Slim.
I didn't make any comment on Carlos.